Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Genesis isn't the only creation account in the Old Testament. Yeah, you heard me right. While Genesis might be the one everybody knows, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, the whole deal, it's just one version. There are other stories tucked away in places you wouldn't expect, and they tell a very different tale. So, let's dig into this. Here's where it gets crazy, Psalm 74. You've probably heard of the Psalms, songs, prayers, poetic stuff, right? But what if I told you Psalm 74 isn't just a prayer of distress? Oh no, buried within it, there's a cosmic battle, an ancient fight between God and sea monsters. Yeah, sea monsters. We're talking about a world where creation wasn't this smooth, orderly process, but a violent struggle between Yahweh and forces of chaos. Listen to this, it was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan. Psalm 74 verses 13 to 14. That's not Genesis. That's not Let There Be Light, or a garden full of flowers. This is God fighting Leviathan, a gigantic, multi-headed sea beast. Leviathan, people. It's like a scene out of a fantasy novel or some ancient myth, and it sounds an awful lot like stories from other ancient cultures, like Babylonian mythology, where their god Marduk fights the sea monster Tiamat to bring order to the universe. Now let's stop and think for a second. You've got Genesis 1, where God speaks the universe into existence in this calm, ordered way. But then you've got Psalm 74, which describes God waging war to bring order out of chaos. That's two completely different narratives about how the world came to be, hidden in plain sight. And this isn't some minor detail. This changes the whole way you think about creation. Because here's the question nobody asks. Why does the Bible have more than one creation story? Why do we get this epic cosmic battle alongside the more familiar story where God just speaks everything into being? Now, let's talk about Leviathan for a minute. Why this creature shows up in more than one place. He's a symbol of chaos, of the untamed forces of the sea that the ancient world believed were constantly threatening to break in and destroy the ordered world. The idea here is that God, the Creator, doesn't just make the world, He has to defend it from chaos. This is huge because it totally flips the way we think about creation. It's not a one-and-done act, it's a struggle, a cosmic fight to keep things from falling apart. This battle narrative isn't just a poetic metaphor. It taps into a deep, ancient idea that the sea, this wild, untamable force, was a threat to order, to life, to creation itself. And God's role isn't just to build the universe, but to defend it from these chaotic forces. So in Psalm 74, creation isn't finished, it's ongoing, and God has to keep chaos at bay. Here's where it gets even wilder, Psalm 89. This one also talks about God crushing a sea monster, this time called Rariab, yet another name for the forces of chaos. You rule over the surging sea, when its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rariab like one of the slain, Psalm 89 verses 9 to 10. So again, we see this idea of God as a cosmic warrior, not just a creator but a conqueror fighting to maintain order. And here's the thing, nobody ever talks about these passages. Everyone's focused on Genesis. But the Old Testament is filled with these little gems, these fragments of different creation myths, and when you put them together, you get a much more complex picture. A picture that shows God not as a distant, detached creator, but as someone who's in the trenches, battling against chaos. And let's be real, that's not the image most people have of the God of the Bible, is it? But it's right there, Leviathan, Rariab, the raging sea, the battle to keep the universe from falling back into chaos. Now, this raises a huge question, why? Why would these stories, these epic battles, be included in the same sacred text as the peaceful, orderly creation story we all know from Genesis? Were the writers of the Bible trying to send a message? Or were they preserving older stories from a time when people believed the world was always teetering on the edge of disaster, needing a powerful deity to hold it all together? One thing's for sure, Genesis doesn't tell the whole story, and once you see these other creation accounts, you can't unsee them. They're there, they're vivid, and they offer a totally different view of who God is and what creation means. A God who fights to maintain order is a far cry from the serene, all-powerful figure we're used to hearing about. But that's the beauty of it, right? It's not simple, it's not neat, it's messy, and that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. Let me tell you something nobody seems to be talking about. The Psalms and Isaiah, they're packed with creation stories that completely fly under the radar. People think they know the Old Testament, but there's this whole side of it they've probably missed. If you thought Genesis had all the answers, these texts are about to blow that out of the water. Psalm 89 is a prime example. It's not just a song of praise, it's a declaration of cosmic power. God isn't just creating the world here, he's actively crushing his enemies to keep it all from spiraling into chaos. That's right, creation in this psalm is built on victory, not peace. God's strength isn't in words alone, like "let there be light." No, this time it's his mighty arm that gets things done, crushing Rariab, this primal force of disorder, right in the middle of the cosmic stage. This isn't the gentle Genesis we're used to hearing about. It's battle scars and brute force. Then we get into Isaiah. You think of Isaiah, you think of prophecy, right? Visions of the future, calls for repentance. But here's the kicker. Isaiah 40 gives us a creation narrative where God isn't just sitting back watching everything unfold. He's stretching out the heavens like a warrior pitching his tent after the battle. And it's not just poetic imagery. This is Isaiah's way of telling us that creation is still in process. God's still working, shaping, imposing order where there wasn't any. In other words, he didn't stop after Genesis. Creation's a continuous project, and it's anything but passive. There's something undeniably raw about how these texts talk about the world. In Isaiah 51, God's creation is described like an act of defiance. He doesn't just organize the universe, he pierces through the forces that want to tear it apart. This isn't "let there be light" in the middle of the void. This is God taking on the monsters of chaos and making sure they stay down. And we don't talk about this. These aren't just footnotes, they're full-fledged, dynamic creation accounts that paint a totally different picture of God. He's not just some distant architect, his hands-on in the fray, making sure the whole thing doesn't collapse. The Psalms and Isaiah aren't giving us a God who's done after 6 days. They show a God at war with disorder, constantly fighting to hold the universe together. Here's something people really don't like to talk about when it comes to the Bible. The two creation accounts in Genesis don't match up. You've got Genesis 1, the one everybody knows. God creates light, separates the waters, dry land appears, then all the plants, animals, and finally humans, right? Sounds simple. But flip the page to Genesis 2, and suddenly the story changes. And not just a little. The whole order of creation is completely different. In Genesis 1, it's light first, then water, then the rest of creation follows in this neat sequence, ending with humans as the pinnacle of God's work. But in Genesis 2, there's no mention of God starting with light. Instead, the focus is immediately on land, and humans seem to come into the picture almost right away, long before the plants and animals are even on the scene. So which is it? Did God start with the cosmic light show, or was it all about the dust of the earth and creating man first? Let's get into the nitty-gritty, because this isn't just a matter of flipping some details around. These two chapters present two different visions of how the world came to be. Genesis 1 is all about order. Each day builds on the previous one. Everything comes into existence with a clear purpose, like pieces of a perfectly designed puzzle. It's God speaking things into being, effortlessly with a divine script in his hands. But Genesis 2? It's way more hands-on. God's not just speaking life into existence here. He's forming man out of dust like a sculptor, planting a garden with his own hands, breathing life into Adam directly. It's personal, almost like we're getting a closer look at the creative process, and it's messy. There's no timeline, no methodical step-by-step creation one. It's immediate and, dare I say, improvised. Now, here's the question. Why the two stories? Why the tension between them? Most people try to harmonize these two accounts, bending over backward to explain how they fit together. But the truth is, the Bible doesn't force them to align. They're left there side by side with these blatant differences, as if the text is daring us to notice. If you look at Genesis 2, creation almost seems to revolve around humanity. Man is the centerpiece, created first before any other living thing. God plants the garden specifically for Adam and brings forth plants and animals afterward, almost as if they're secondary to man's existence. Compare that to Genesis 1, where humans come at the end. after everything else is perfectly set in place, like a final touch on a masterpiece. Two different visions of humanity's role in creation. In Genesis 1, we're part of the grand design, a piece of a bigger system. In Genesis 2, we're the reason for the system. The world exists for us. That's a massive difference in perspective. It completely shifts the way we understand our place in the universe. Are we just another part of creation, or are we the reason the whole thing exists? And let's not forget the timeline clash. Genesis 1 gives us that famous 7-day structure, each day meticulously planned from light to land to life. But in Genesis 2, there's no timeline. It just happens. We go from dust to life, to plants, to animals, to the creation of woman, with no clear indication of how long any of it takes. It's a fluid, organic process. These two accounts leave us with a pretty bold conclusion. Creation in the Bible is not a singular, straightforward narrative. It's complex, layered, and at times contradictory. You have to ask yourself, why was the Bible written this way? Why were these two conflicting versions of creation placed back to back? It's almost as if the text itself is challenging us to engage with it, not to settle for easy answers. This isn't about finding the correct story, it's about recognizing that the Bible gives us multiple lenses through which to view creation, one orderly and cosmic, the other intimate and raw. And they don't just sit there quietly, they clash, they force us to confront the possibility that creation wasn't some simple, linear event. It was, and maybe still is, a complex, messy, and ongoing process. Let's shift gears and dive into something most people never connect with the Bible: Canaanite mythology. Yeah, you heard that right. The ancient Israelites were surrounded by cultures with their own gods, their own myths, and their own stories about how the universe came to be. And here's the wild part: these influences crept into the Bible, showing up in ways that most people would never expect. One of the most dramatic examples? God versus Tannin, the sea monster. Before you start thinking, wait, isn't that just some random myth? Let's get into the text. Isaiah 27 verse 1 drops a bombshell. In that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea. That monster of the sea. That's Tannin, a chaos beast straight out of the Canaanite playbook. And this isn't some fringe verse hidden in the Bible. This is the prophet Isaiah, one of the major voices of the Old Testament, calling out a cosmic battle between God and this ancient sea monster. Tannin wasn't just a random creature. In Canaanite mythology, the god Baal, Yer, the same Baal who's mentioned all over the Old Testament as the god of Israel's enemies, has got his own epic fight with the sea god Yam and this chaos monster Tannin. Baal has to defeat these forces of chaos to establish order, to secure his kingship over the heavens. Sound familiar? It should, because this is exactly the kind of cosmic battle we see reflected in Isaiah and the Psalms. But wait, why is this in the Bible? Shouldn't the God of Israel be totally separate from these pagan myths? Here's the kicker. The ancient Israelites weren't living in a cultural vacuum. They were part of the ancient Near East, rubbing shoulders with Canaanites, Babylonians, and Egyptians, all of whom had their own powerful myths about gods fighting chaos to create the world. And somehow, some way, these myths left their mark on the biblical texts. Now, this isn't about suggesting that the Bible copied Canaanite myths. But there's no denying that these stories about God battling the forces of chaos bear a striking resemblance to the Canaanite story of Baal versus Yam and Tannin. So what's going on here? Why does Yahweh, the God of Israel, need to fight sea monsters like Tannin? This points to something much deeper. In the Bible, God isn't just a creator who builds the world and steps back. He's a warrior, actively fighting to maintain order against the forces of chaos. This isn't a calm, peaceful creation where everything just falls into place. It's a battle, and those forces of chaos, like Tannin, are lurking, threatening to tear everything apart. This image of God isn't a distant deity quietly shaping the world from afar. This is a God who's in a fight, taking on the very embodiment of chaos. You've got Psalm 74 verse 13, where it says, "It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters." This isn't just poetry. This is an echo of the Canaanite myth, but this time it's Yahweh, not Baal, who's the ultimate victor. In the ancient world, this would have been a direct challenge to the surrounding cultures. Your gods might battle the forces of chaos, but it's our God Yahweh who is the true conqueror. And this wasn't just about mythology, it was about power. By absorbing elements of the Canaanite stories, but flipping the script, the Bible isn't just telling us about creation. It's making a bold, even confrontational statement about who's really in control of the universe. It's not Baal, it's not Yam, it's Yahweh, and he's the one with the power to crush the chaos monsters. So think about this, the Bible, which we often think of as totally separate from the myths and legends of the ancient world, is actually engaging with them, reframing them. It's taking the cultural context of Israel's neighbors, their gods, their chaos monsters, and flipping it, showing that Yahweh is the one who truly rules the cosmos. But he doesn't do it by peaceful decree. He does it by battle, by taking on the very forces of chaos and proving his dominance. This is a God who's dangerous, who fights on the edge of chaos and order, and who stakes his claim not just through creation, but through conquest. That's not the Sunday school version of God. That's not the calm, peaceful creator we're used to hearing about. This is a God who's in the middle of a cosmic struggle. A God who doesn't just create, he fights for his creation. Let's talk about Proverbs 8, a chapter that almost never gets a mention when people talk about biblical creation stories. And yet, it holds one of the most intriguing, most mysterious narratives about how the universe came into being. Unlike Genesis or the Psalms, where creation is a direct act of God's power, Proverbs 8 gives us something completely different, creation through wisdom, or as the Hebrew calls it, chokmah. Now, here's the twist. Wisdom in this chapter isn't just a trait or an abstract concept. No, wisdom is personified. She's an actual character in the story of creation, and she's been there from the very beginning. Proverbs 8 verses 22 to 31 presents her as a companion to God, a kind of cosmic architect working alongside him. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works, before his deeds of old, wisdom says. That's right, before light, before water, before the earth itself, there was wisdom. She's not just sitting on the sidelines watching God create the universe like some detached observer. Wisdom is actively involved, playing a critical role in how the world takes shape. In Proverbs 8 verse 30, wisdom says, "Then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world." She's not just present, she's rejoicing, delighting, and in a sense, she's co-creating with God. Now, let's pause and think about that for a second. The Bible just gave us a picture where creation wasn't a solo act. God, the all-powerful creator, didn't work alone. He brought wisdom into the process, and that changes everything we think we know about how the universe came to be. In Genesis, God speaks and things come into existence. In Psalms, God fights chaos to carve out the world. But in Proverbs 8, creation is about craftsmanship, about intelligence, about design. Wisdom isn't brute force. She's the mastermind, the one who understands the fine details, the underlying laws that hold everything together. Let's go deeper into what this really means. If wisdom was there from the beginning, this means creation wasn't just an act of divine will. It was guided by intelligence, by order, by a deep understanding of how everything should work. There's a logic to the universe, a blueprint, and it's wisdom who laid that blueprint down. Proverbs 8 paints creation not as a chaotic struggle, but as a carefully thought-out masterpiece, with wisdom being the key to its success. But hold up, it gets even more fascinating. Wisdom says she was delighting in the act of creation. There's this sense of joy, of playfulness in how she describes her role. This isn't the cold, calculated order you might expect. There's passion here. Wisdom is reveling in the process, almost like she's not just shaping creation, she's enjoying it. She's celebrating it. And that adds a whole new layer to how we understand the biblical narrative of creation. This isn't just about a distant God creating the world as an act of power. It's about collaboration. It's about joy. Now, if we look at Proverbs 8 carefully, this might be one of the most subversive creation narratives in the entire Bible. Why? Because it challenges the idea that God acted alone in creation. It presents the idea that wisdom, a female personification no less, was there right next to God, working alongside him. In a tradition where male imagery dominates, where God is always described in masculine terms, here we have chokmah, a feminine figure, deeply involved in the most important act of all, the creation of the world. So why don't we hear more about this? Why isn't Proverbs 8 discussed alongside Genesis when we talk about creation? Maybe because it offers a vision of creation that doesn't fit neatly into the categories most people are comfortable with. It doesn't show us a God who works alone. It doesn't give us a creation built solely on power or conflict. Instead, it gives us a cooperative act, where wisdom, chokmah, guides and shapes the world with intelligence and joy. Let's get into something that will blow your mind about the Bible. It wasn't written by just one author, and it doesn't present one smooth, unified narrative. No, the Old Testament is a patchwork of different sources, different traditions, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and 2. These two stories come from two completely different sources, the priestly source P and the Yahweh source J. First, let's talk about the priestly source, Genesis 1. This account is structured, measured, almost liturgical. God is distant, authoritative, speaking creation into existence like a divine CEO issuing orders from the boardroom. It's all about hierarchy, about setting things in their proper place, the heavens, the earth, the seas, the creatures, everything has its designated time and role, and humanity. We're created last, as the crown of creation, placed above all other living things. But here's where things start to shift. Flip over to Genesis 2, and suddenly the story feels completely different. This is the Yahweh source and the tone here. It's earthy, personal, even intimate. God isn't speaking from on high anymore. He's down in the dirt, literally. Instead of commanding the world into being with his voice, God is forming man out of the soil with his hands, like a potter molding clay. This God is present, tangible, and close. These two sources are presenting two completely different versions of God. The priestly God is transcendent, almost untouchable, while the Yahweh's God is immanent, actively involved in the nitty-gritty of creation. They're both Yahweh, but the way they relate to the world couldn't be more different. Let's get into the details, because this isn't just about tone or style, it's about how the world comes into being. In the priestly account, God creates through order and structure, laying out the cosmos day by day, piece by piece, like a finely tuned machine. It's precise, it's planned, everything is set in its place before humanity even arrives on the scene. But in the Yahwist account, it's almost like the story starts with chaos and God steps in to organize it. In Genesis 2, there's no grand proclamation of light or separation of waters. Instead, the earth is barren, empty, and God has to get to work. He plants a garden, forms man, and only then starts thinking about the rest of creation. Humanity isn't the final touch. It's the starting point. Man is made before plants, before animals. God creates the environment around man for his sake. Now, why does this matter? It matters because these two sources aren't just telling different stories, they're telling us different things about who God is and what creation means. In the priestly version, God is a cosmic ruler, above and beyond creation, setting everything into motion with his word. In the Yahwist version, God is a craftsman, shaping the world with his hands, intimately connected to his creation. This duality raises some serious questions about how the Bible was put together. Why didn't the editors of the Old Testament just choose one version of the story? Why place these two contradictory accounts side by side? Here's the thing they didn't need to. The Bible wasn't meant to be neat. It's a reflection of centuries of tradition passed down through different communities, each with their own understanding of who God is and how the world came to be. And these differences weren't hidden, they were preserved. The priestly source likely came from a group of scribes, possibly during or after the Babylonian exile, who were concerned with ritual and order, with keeping things structured in the face of chaos. Their creation story reflects that need for control, for hierarchy, for everything to have its place. But the Yahweh source? That's an older tradition, one that sees God as a much more hands-on figure, directly involved in the lives of his creation, concerned with the relationship between humanity and the earth. Let's bring this full circle and ask the big question. Why does the Bible have so many different creation stories? We've already looked at Genesis 1 and 2, Psalms, Isaiah, and Proverbs, each one offering a different vision of how the world came to be. So what's going on here? Why didn't the Bible just stick with one consistent narrative? The answer? The Bible is not trying to give us a single linear explanation of creation. It's giving us multiple lenses, multiple voices, and each one brings something unique to the table. Think about it. Each of these stories comes from a different tradition, a different source, a different time in Israel's history. They're telling us not just how the world was made, but what creation meant to the people who were telling these stories. Look at Genesis 1, for example. That's a story of order. The world is set up like a finely tuned machine, everything in its place, everything according to a divine plan. It's a vision of a powerful, transcendent God speaking the universe into existence with the sheer force of his will. But then you get Genesis 2, and it's like someone hit the reset button. Here, we have a God who's up close and personal. He's not speaking creation into being from a distance. He's down in the dirt, forming man from clay, planting gardens with his own hands. Creation here is intimate, relational. It's about connection. And then we've got the Psalms and Isaiah, where creation is portrayed as this epic battle. God isn't just creating, he's fighting off the forces of chaos. He's slaying sea monsters, splitting the sea monsters, splitting the seas, and establishing his rule over the universe through raw, cosmic power. It's a totally different vision of creation, one that paints God not just as a creator, but as a warrior who has to keep chaos at bay. And let's not forget Proverbs 8, where creation isn't about power or battle at all, it's about wisdom. Here, creation is a collaborative act, with God and wisdom working together to shape the universe. It's a creation story based on intelligence, on craftsmanship, on the joy of making something beautiful. So what does this all mean? It means that creation in the Bible is far more complex, far more dynamic than most people realize. It's not just about how the world was made, it's about who God is. It's about different perspectives on his power, his relationship with the world, and his role in the ongoing struggle between order and chaos. These stories aren't just competing with each other, they're complementing each other. They're giving us a fuller, richer picture of God's nature, of what it means to create, and what it means to create, and what it means to exist in a world that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by divine hands. So why so many creation stories? Because one version could never capture the full mystery of creation. The Bible doesn't give us easy answers because creation itself isn't an easy concept. It's multifaceted, it's mysterious, and the truth is, it can't be confined to a single narrative. In the end, these stories challenge us to think deeper, to embrace the complexity, and to understand that the act of creation, whether through power, through wisdom, through battle, or through love, defies simple explanations. Thank you for sticking with me through this dive into the many creation accounts in the Old Testament. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's keep these conversations going. And as always, God bless you all.